The dust was the first thing and the last. It was the alpha and the omega of her world, a fine, ochre-colored shroud that settled on everything with the patient finality of death. It coated Alara's tongue, a gritty sacrament of her failure. It worked its way into the frayed lace of her wedding dress, the one she still wore because it was the sturdiest garment she owned, a cruel joke stitched in white satin and now dyed the color of the barren earth. The wind, a constant, whining accomplice, lifted the hem and showed the cracked leather of her husband's boots underneath, another inheritance she had not asked for. The boots were too big. Every part of this life was too big for her. The sky, a vast and merciless blue canvas. The silence, a crushing weight that filled the gaps between the wind's howls. The homestead, a raw scar of hope that had festered into an open wound on the face of the plains. She stood at the edge of the dry well, its stone mouth gaping at the empty sky. For 3 days she had done this, lowering the bucket into the dark, listening for the gentle splash that never came, and hauling it back up, light and mocking. The rope burns on her palms were a testament to her foolish, desperate optimism. Now, she simply stared into the abyss, her own reflection a wavering ghost in the deep shadow. Her face was a mask of dust and sun, her eyes hollowed out by a hunger that went deeper than her stomach. It was a hunger for water, yes, but also for a voice that wasn't the wind's, for a touch that wasn't the sun's scorching hand. It was a hunger for the life she had been promised, the one Thomas had painted in letters full of shimmering words like opportunity and future, and our own piece of heaven. He had come out first to build their heaven. He had sent for her, and then he had vanished into the very landscape he'd vowed to conquer, leaving her with a half-finished sod house, a deed with her name on it, and a silence that screamed his absence. The sun beat down on her shoulders, the heat of physical presence that seemed to press her toward the edge of the well. A dizzying thought, dark and cool as the depths below, whispered in her mind. It would be an end to the thirst, an end to the dust, an end to the memory of the town's pitying glances and the storekeeper's tight-lipped refusal of credit. Her hand tightened on the rough stones lining the well. The lace at her cuff, brittle with dirt, snagged and tore with a faint, sad sound. The sound broke the spell. No, she would not give the plains that satisfaction. She would not let this land swallow her as it had swallowed her husband, her hopes, her future. There was a stubborn, flickering ember deep within her, a thing she hadn't known she possessed until everything else was stripped away. It was a miserable, hard little kernel of defiance. She turned away from the well, her gaze sweeping over the parched, cracked earth of her claim. The corn stalks were brown skeletons rattling in the wind. The small vegetable patch was a collection of withered leaves and dusty mounds. Everything she had touched had died. It was a kingdom of failure, and she was its tattered, throneless queen. The only structure that seemed to defy the decay was the blacksmith's forge, a distant smudge of smoke at the edge of the horizon, miles away, where the lonely track to the town of Providence began. The man who worked it was an outcast, a figure of rumor and fear. They said he'd fought in the war, on the wrong side. They said he was half savage. They said he kept to himself for reasons no decent person would want to know. She had seen him once, from a distance, a large, dark shape moving against the hellish glow of his fire, and had hurried away, pulling her shawl tighter. But now, desperation was a more potent force than fear. Her last sack of flour was little more than a dusty film at the bottom. Her water barrel was empty. The town had offered no charity, only judgment. The blacksmith was her last, unthinkable option. What did she have to trade? Her hands were calloused and clumsy, her body thin and weak. She looked down at herself, at the ruined dress. She had one skill left from the life before this one. She could sew a fine seam. It was a pathetic offering against the crushing needs of survival. She imagined standing before that fearsome man, the heat of his forge on her face, and making her plea. The thought was humiliating, terrifying. But the alternative was to lie down in her dusty sod house and let the wind and the silence have her. With a resolve born of absolute necessity, she started walking. She did not go back into the house for a bonnet or a bag. There was nothing in there worth taking, and the sun could do no more to ruin her. She simply placed one oversized boot in front of the other, her eyes fixed on that thin plume of smoke in the distance. The tattered hem of her wedding dress whispered against the baked earth, a sound like dry leaves skittering before a storm. Each step was an act of will, a refusal to become a ghost before she was dead. The dust rose in little puffs around her feet, trying to reclaim her, to pull her down into its suffocating embrace. But for now, she was still moving. For now, the ember of defiance still burned. The air was thick and hot, shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon, making the distant forge seem to tremble, a mirage of fire and salvation in a world that offered only dust. She did not know what she would say, or what she would do. She only knew she had to get there. The town of Providence was less a community and more a collection of suspicions huddled together against the vastness of the plains. Its single dusty street was lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean on one another for support, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. As Alara walked its length, windows became frames for staring, judgmental eyes. Doors that had been opened to the sluggish breeze were quietly closed. She was a known quantity here, the abandoned wife, the failed homesteader, a walking specter of bad luck. Her presence was an unwelcome reminder that the promises of this land were often lies, and that failure was a contagion they all feared. She kept her gaze fixed on the warped planks of the boardwalk, feeling the weight of their silent condemnation. It was a heavier burden than the sun. She had already suffered the indignity of the general store. Mr. Abernathy, a man with a face like a clenched fist, had looked down his spectacles at her, his lips a thin, merciless line. "Credit is for them that has prospects, Mrs. Hayes," he had said, his voice loud enough for the other customers to hear. "Your prospects, well, they seem to have dried up along with your well." The quiet snickers that followed him had felt like tiny, sharp stones thrown against her skin. She had left with her empty flour sack and a fresh, burning layer of shame. That was 2 days ago. The shame had since hardened into a bitter resolve. She would not beg from them again. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Her path took her past the church, its white paint blistered and grayed, its steeple a lonely finger pointing at a heaven that felt very far away. She remembered sitting in one of its hard pews just after she'd arrived, Thomas beside her, his hand warm and solid on hers. The sermon had been about fortitude, about building a new Eden in the wilderness. She had believed it then. Now, the words were ashes in her memory. The wilderness was winning. Eden was a myth. At the far end of the street, where the town petered out into scrub and rock, stood the blacksmith's forge. It was set apart, as if the town itself had decided to ostracize the structure and the man within it. It was not built of wood like the other buildings, but of dark, heavy river stones, mortared together so thickly it looked more like a fortress than a workshop. Smoke, black and greasy, curled from a stone chimney, staining the pristine blue of the sky. The rhythmic, percussive clang of a hammer on steel rang out, a steady, powerful heartbeat in the oppressive silence. It was a sound of purpose, of creation in a place defined by decay. It was the most alive sound she had heard in months. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her resolve. The stories about the blacksmith, Silas, they called him, swirled in her mind. A man who spoke little and smiled less. A man whose sighs and silence were interpreted as menace. They said he could fix anything made of metal, but that his touch could just as easily break things. Men went to him for plowshares and horseshoes, conducting their business with curt, necessary words before retreating back to the safety of the town's gossip. No woman ever went near the place. She stopped 100 feet away, partially concealed by a scraggly, sun-bleached mesquite. From here, she could see into the wide, open front of the forge. The interior was a cavern of leaping shadows and fiery light. A figure moved within, broad-shouldered and immense, silhouetted against the crimson heart of the fire. He lifted a heavy hammer, the muscles in his back and arms cording with the effort, and brought it down with a deafening crash that sent a shower of orange sparks into the gloom. The sound vibrated through the soles of her boots. He was a creature of fire and iron, a being utterly alien to her world of brittle lace and dying corn. What could she possibly say to such a man? How could she explain the intricate, devastating web of her needs? My well is dry, my spirit is broken, my husband is gone, and I am starving. Can you help me? The words were impossible, a confession of utter defeat. Her pride, the last tattered remnant of the woman she used to be, reared up. She could not. She would turn back, return to the sod house, and meet her fate with dignity. But then the man turned, wiping a forearm across his brow, and for a moment his face was illuminated by the forge light. It was not the face of a monster. It was a hard face, certainly, carved with lines of weariness and concentration. His hair was dark and shorn short, his beard trimmed close to his jaw. But his eyes, even from this distance, seemed to hold a deep, steady quietness, not malice. He moved with an economy of motion, a powerful grace that spoke of absolute competence. He plunged the glowing piece of metal into a trough of water, and a furious hiss of steam erupted, momentarily obscuring him from view. In that cloud of steam, she saw her own situation with stark clarity. Pride was a luxury for those with full bellies and a roof that didn't leak. Dignity was a fine concept, but it wouldn't fill a water bucket. Her choice was simple and brutal. Face this man, or face a slow, solitary death. The ember of defiance inside her flared. She had walked all this way. She would not falter now. Taking a deep, dusty breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she stepped out from behind the mesquite tree. She straightened her back, a gesture that felt both futile and necessary, and began to walk the final 100 feet. The sound of the hammer had stopped. He had seen her. She felt his gaze on her, heavy and unreadable, as she crossed the open, sun-baked ground that separated the town from his forge. The dust puffed up around her ankles with every step. Her ruined wedding dress, a flag of surrender, trailed behind her. She did not know if she was walking toward her salvation or just a different kind of end. She only knew that she was done with standing still. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. She was an apparition of lace and desperation, approaching a fortress of stone and fire. He did not move as she approached, standing with the hammer held loosely in one hand at his side. The heat from the forge washed over her in a staggering wave, a stark contrast to the hollow coldness of her fear. It smelled of coal smoke, hot metal, and sweat. It was the smell of hard, relentless work. Up close, he was even larger than he had appeared from a distance, a solid wall of a man who blocked the light from the forge's mouth. His shirt, a simple homespun thing, was dark with sweat and smudged with soot. A long, puckered scar ran from his temple down his jaw on one side, a pale track through his sun-darkened skin. His eyes, she now saw, were a startlingly clear shade of gray, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. They took in her tattered dress, her chapped lips, the desperation she knew must be etched onto her face. Yet, his expression remained neutral, a mask of stone. She stopped a few feet from him, her throat tight and dry. The words she had rehearsed, the simple, direct pleas, vanished. All she could feel was the gulf between them. He, a pillar of strength and capability. She, a fragile ruin. The silence was an accusation. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like unpolished stone, and it held no judgment, no pity, no welcome. It was simply a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of her presence. She had to swallow twice before she could speak. Her own voice was a stranger's, a thin, reedy whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing a strength she did not feel. "I need work done." He glanced past her, toward the empty plains that stretched behind her. "Your wagon?" "I have no wagon," the admission cost her. "It's a pump handle. From my well. It's broken." This was a lie, or at least a simplification. The handle was fine, the well was empty. But she needed a reason, a tangible transaction to mask the raw, gaping need that had driven her here. A broken tool was a problem a blacksmith could solve. A broken life was not. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Bring it." The cold dread of her lie washed over her. I couldn't carry it. It's too heavy." For the first time, a flicker of something moved in his stone-gray eyes. It might have been suspicion, or perhaps just contemplation. He looked at her hands, which she quickly hid in the folds of her skirt. They were raw from the well rope, blistered and torn. He had to have seen them. He knew she was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. She braced for dismissal, for the curt turn of his back that would send her away. Instead, he set the hammer down on the anvil with a solid, definitive thud. "Where is your claim?" 2 miles east," she whispered, pointing with a trembling hand. The old Miller place. He looked in the direction she indicated, his gaze sweeping over the shimmering heat haze. He said nothing for a long moment, and Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had come all this way only to be undone by a clumsy lie. She should have just told him the truth. But what was the truth? That she was starving? That she was so lonely the silence had begun to feel like a physical weight on her chest. "I have no money," she blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to be honest about something. "Not right now. But the corn. When the corn comes in, I can pay you. Or I can," she trailed off, her mind racing for a skill, a service, anything of value. "I can mend. I sew a fine seam." She held up the edge of her own ruined sleeve as if it were proof, a pathetic advertisement for her only trade. He looked from her face to the frayed lace and back again. His expression did not change, but she felt as if he were seeing straight through her, past the lies and the desperation, to the terrified, determined core of her. He saw the foolish pride that had made her walk 2 miles to ask for a repair she didn't need, instead of simply asking for a cup of water. He turned and walked back into the forge, his broad back eclipsing the fire. Her hope plummeted. He was dismissing her. Of course he was. She was a fool to have come here. She stood frozen for a moment, the heat of the forge on her face, the vast, empty plains at her back. Humiliation, hot and sharp, brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry. Not here. She turned to leave, to begin the long, defeated walk home. "Wait." The single word stopped her. It was not a command, but a statement. She turned back. He was emerging from the shadows of the forge, carrying a large metal canteen. He walked past her without a word and went to a hand pump that stood beside the building, half hidden by a stack of iron bars. He began to work the handle, and with a groan and a screech, water, clean, beautiful water, gushed out into the dirt. He rinsed the canteen, then filled it to the brim. He screwed the cap on tight and walked back to her, holding it out. She stared at the canteen as if it were a holy relic. Her thirst was a living thing inside her, a clawing creature. But to take it felt like a surrender. It was charity, the very thing she had sworn she would not accept. "I can't," she began, her voice thick. "It's water," he said, his tone flat, cutting off her protest. "The pump handle will be a long walk in this heat." He was giving her an excuse, a way to accept the gift without sacrificing the last of her pride. He was pretending to believe her lie. Slowly, her hands trembling, she reached out and took the canteen. It was heavy and cool against her hot, blistered skin. The weight of it was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. He gave another one of his slow, deliberate nods. "I will come by tomorrow, to look at the pump." He turned then and went back to his anvil, picking up the hammer as if she were already gone, his attention already returned to the glowing metal in the fire. The transaction was over. Alara stood for a moment longer, clutching the canteen to her chest. He had given her water. He had offered his help. And he had, in his own gruff, silent way, given her something far more precious, a sliver of dignity. He had allowed her to keep her story. With the heavy canteen clutched in her hands, she turned and began the long walk back, the weight of the water a solid, reassuring promise against her body. The sun was still hot, the wind still relentless, but the world felt different now. It was no less harsh, but it was, for the first time in a long time, no longer entirely empty. The walk back to the sod house was an exercise in discipline. Every instinct screamed at her to uncap the canteen and drink until she was sick, but she resisted. She allowed herself only 3 small sips, savoring the cool, clean taste of the water as it soothed her cracked throat, forcing herself to make it last. The water was a loan against a future she was not yet certain she had. It was a resource to be managed, a responsibility. The weight of the canteen was a constant reminder of the blacksmith's quiet, unexpected grace, and the lie she now had to maintain. He was coming tomorrow. He was coming to fix a pump that was not broken, to solve a problem that was not real. The thought filled her with a new kind of anxiety, a knot of dread that sat beside the fragile bloom of hope in her stomach. When she reached her homestead, the place looked even more desolate than when she had left. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the withered corn stalks, and the sod house seemed to slump into the earth, as if tired of its own existence. Inside, the air was stale and hot. The last of the daylight struggled through the single, grimy window pane. She placed the canteen on the rough-hewn table with the reverence of a priestess placing a chalice on an altar. It was the only object in the room that seemed full of life. She drank another small sip, then used a few precious drops to dampen a cloth and wipe the layers of dust from her face. The coolness on her skin was a shock, a forgotten pleasure. She spent the evening in a state of nervous preparation. What does one do when a near stranger, a figure of myth and rumor, is coming to one's home? She swept the packed earth floor with a worn-out broom, raising clouds of the very dust she was trying to banish. She straightened the thin blanket on her cot. She even attempted to wash her dress in the last dregs of water from her barrel, a futile effort that only succeeded in turning the grime into a uniform grayness. She looked at her reflection in the cracked shard of mirror she kept on the wall. A stranger stared back, gaunt and wild-eyed, a woman she barely recognized. The Alara who had arrived on these plains had been soft, full of nervous laughter and easy tears. This woman was pared down to bone and will, her edges sharpened by hardship. Sleep did not come easily. She lay on her cot, listening to the ceaseless wind and the lonely cry of a coyote. She thought of Silas, the blacksmith. His silence was not empty, she decided. It was watchful. He had looked at her and seen more than she'd intended to show. He had understood her desperation without her having to voice it, and had responded not with pity, but with a practical act of kindness. It was a language she was beginning to understand, a language of deeds, not words. In this place, words were cheap. Thomas's letters had been full of beautiful words, and they had ultimately meant nothing. Silas had said fewer than 20 words to her, and yet he had given her water. He had given her tomorrow. The next day, she was up before the sun, her anxiety a living thing in her gut. She busied herself with meaningless tasks, pacing the small confines of the house. She rehearsed what she would say. She would explain that, upon her return, she had managed to fix the handle herself, a lucky jiggle, a fortunate knock. It was a flimsy story, but it was all she had. She could then offer him a portion of her precious water as thanks, a transaction completed, her debt, in some small way, repaid. She saw him long before he arrived, a solitary figure walking steadily across the plains. He did not ride a horse, but moved on foot, carrying a heavy leather satchel of tools slung over his shoulder. He moved with a purpose that seemed to tame the wildness of the landscape around him. As he drew closer, she saw that he was not just a blacksmith walking to a job. He was reading the land, his eyes scanning the horizon, the ground, the sky. He was a part of this place in a way she could never be. She was a trespasser. He belonged. She met him by the well, her hands twisting in the folds of her damp dress. "Mr. Silas," she said, her voice more stable than she expected. He gave a curt nod, his gaze going immediately to the pump. "Ma'am, you shouldn't have troubled yourself," she began, the lie feeling clumsy and foolish on her tongue. "When I returned yesterday, I managed to fix it. It must have just been stuck." He looked at her, then at the pump, then back at her. His gray eyes were unreadable, but she felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. He knew. Of course he knew. He was a man who understood the mechanics of things, the precise ways in which metal and wood could break and be mended. He would know a flimsy lie about a stuck handle when he heard one. He did not call her on it. He simply walked to the pump, took hold of the handle, and worked it up and down. A dry, rattling, empty sound emerged from the well's depths. He did this 3 times, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. Then he stopped and looked down into the dark shaft, his expression unchanging. He had not come to fix the pump handle. He had come to confirm what he already suspected. He had come to see the empty well for himself. The silence that followed was the most profound she had ever experienced. It was a silence in which her foolish pride was stripped bare, her desperation laid out for him to see. There was nowhere to hide. He knew she was a liar. He knew she was destitute. He knew everything. She waited for the judgment, the scorn, the quiet turning of his back. It was what she expected. It was what she deserved. He turned to face her, his shadow falling over her. He was so tall, so solid. "The water table has dropped," he said, his voice a low, factual rumble. happens in a drought. Sometimes it comes back after a good rain. Sometimes it doesn't. He was not stating an accusation, but a fact of the land, as impersonal as the wind. He was giving her a new story, a better one. Not a story of her failure, but of the land's caprice. He looked around the homestead, his gaze lingering on the withered corn, the cracked earth. This is hard country for corn. Needs too much water. He then looked toward a shallow depression a few hundred yards from the house, where a few stubborn, green-tinged weeds clung to life. That draw might hold water deeper down. Might not. He slung the tool bag from his shoulder and set it on the ground with a heavy thud. Digging a new well is hard work. She stared at him, uncomprehending. I can't pay you for that. I didn't ask for pay, he said. He pulled a heavy spade and a pickaxe from his bag. I asked you to wait yesterday. Now I'm telling you to get a bucket. And with that, he walked toward the draw, his stride long and sure. He paced it out, studying the ground like a scholar studying a difficult text. He kicked at the dirt in a few places, then finally chose a spot and drove the tip of the spade into the hard, unforgiving earth with a grunt of effort. Alara stood by the silent, useless pump, watching him. He had not shamed her. He had not pitied her. He had seen her problem, understood its true nature, and had simply started to work on a solution. He had taken her clumsy lie and transformed it into a shared, practical challenge. Tears pricked her eyes again, but these were different. They were not tears of shame or despair, but of a strange, overwhelming gratitude that was so profound it felt like pain. He had offered her more than water. He had offered her a chance. Wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, she turned, picked up the empty bucket, and walked toward the man who was already digging her a new well under the relentless sun. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, dictated by the sun and the steady, percussive sounds of Silas's work. He would arrive shortly after dawn, a silent, dependable presence on the horizon, and leave as dusk began to purple the sky. He worked with a relentless, focused energy that awed her. The shallow depression he had chosen slowly deepened, becoming a pit, then a hole, the pile of excavated earth growing beside it like a monument to his labor. He spoke little, conserving his breath for the brutal work of swinging the pickaxe and driving the shovel into the compacted soil. The silence between them was not awkward, but companionable, filled with the sounds of effort. The thud of the pick, the scrape of the shovel, his steady breathing, the cry of a distant hawk. Alara's role was to haul the dirt away in the bucket. It was grueling work. The bucket, filled with earth and rock, was heavy, and her arms and back ached with a deep, unfamiliar pain. Her hands, already raw, became calloused and then blistered again. But she did not complain. She did not even think to. Each bucket she emptied was a contribution, a small share in the monumental task. It was her penance for her earlier pride, her payment in sweat for his unasked-for kindness. She felt a strange sense of purpose, a feeling that had been absent for so long. She was no longer just waiting for the land to defeat her. She was actively fighting back, alongside this quiet, formidable man. She brought him water from the canteen he had given her, rationing it carefully. He would stop his work, take the cup she offered, and drain it in one long swallow, his throat working. He would hand the cup back with a nod, a film of dust on his lips, and then immediately return to his digging. There were no wasted words, no unnecessary pleasantries. Their communication was pared down to the essential, a shared task, a common goal. In the midday heat, they would rest in the sliver of shade cast by the sod house. Alara would share what little food she had, a piece of dry johnny cake, a few roasted prairie turnips she'd managed to forage. He would accept it with the same quiet gravity with which he accepted the water, and from his own satchel, he would produce a piece of smoked venison or a handful of dried berries, which he would lay on a clean cloth between them, a silent offering. They ate without speaking, the vast, empty landscape their dining hall. During these quiet moments, she found herself studying him. She learned the map of his face, the way the sun had etched fine lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw when he was concentrating, the faint, pale line of the scar that seemed less a flaw and more a part of his history. She wondered what had caused it, what battles he had fought, what losses had carved that deep quietness into him. But she never asked. She understood, instinctively, that his past was his own, and that trust, in this place, was built not on shared confessions, but on shared labor. One afternoon, as they worked, a shadow fell over them. Alara looked up to see a man on a fine, bay horse. He was dressed in a tailored coat and hat, incongruous and out of place against the harsh landscape. It was Mr. Sterling, the man who owned the largest ranch in the county, the man to whom her husband had been in debt. Sterling's smile was a thin, predatory slash in his manicured beard. "Well, well, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. He looked from her sweat-streaked, dirty face to Silas, who had stopped digging and stood leaning on his shovel, his expression unreadable. Sterling's eyes lingered on Silas with open distaste. "I see you found yourself some help." The word was loaded with insinuation. Alara felt her face flush with anger. She straightened her back. "Mr. Silas is helping me with my well." Sterling chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "A noble effort, but perhaps a futile one. This land is thirsty, Mrs. Hayes. It drinks up hope just as it drinks up the rain." He dismounted, his polished boots sinking slightly into the dust. "I've come to repeat my offer. It's a generous one, considering your circumstances. Sell the claim to me. I'll forgive your late husband's debt and give you enough to buy a ticket back east, where a woman like you belongs." "This is my home," Alara said, the words tasting of defiance. "I am not selling." Sterling's smile tightened. His gaze shifted back to Silas. "Be careful of the company you keep, ma'am. Some folks out here aren't what they seem. They prey on the vulnerable." The threat was clear, aimed at Silas, but meant for her. He was trying to poison the fragile trust that had grown between them. Silas did not react. He remained perfectly still, his knuckles white where he gripped the shovel handle. He did not look at Sterling. He looked only at Alara, his gray eyes steady, waiting for her response. It was a silent question. "Do you believe him?" In that moment, Alara felt a surge of protective loyalty that surprised her with its ferocity. This silent man had shown her more decency and kindness in 3 days than Sterling and the entire town of Providence had shown her in 6 months. She met Silas's gaze and held it, a silent promise passing between them. Then she turned back to Sterling, her voice cold and clear. "The only predator I see here is you, Mr. Sterling. This is my land. Please leave." For a moment, surprise, then fury, flashed in Sterling's eyes. He had expected a weak, desperate widow, not this defiance. He looked from her to Silas and back again, as if seeing them as a united front for the first time. He gave a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor. "Have it your way, Mrs. Hayes. But when this land breaks you, and it will, don't come crying to me. The offer will be off the table." He swung himself back onto his horse, pulled sharply on the reins, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle over them. The silence he left behind was heavy. Alara's heart was still pounding with adrenaline and anger. She looked at Silas, expecting him to say something, to acknowledge the confrontation. He simply bent down, picked up his pickaxe, and swung it into the earth with a powerful, ground-shaking thud. He did not need to speak. The action was his response. He was not leaving. He was staying. He was digging. She picked up her bucket. As she bent to fill it with the earth he had loosened, she noticed something. A darkness, a dampness in the soil he had just overturned. Her breath caught. She reached down, her fingers pushing past the dry surface layer. Underneath, the earth was cool and moist. She looked up at Silas, her eyes wide. He had stopped working and was watching her, a single, deliberate nod his only confirmation. It was not a spring. It was not a river. But it was the promise of water. It was the promise of everything. And standing there, covered in dirt, her body aching with exhaustion, she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. It felt like hope. The discovery of damp earth galvanized them. The work took on a new urgency, a new intensity. The hope was fragile, a tentative promise that could still be snatched away, and they both seemed to understand that it had to be seized upon with every ounce of their strength. The hole grew deeper, descending into the earth's cool, dark secrets. Silas worked like a man possessed, his movements economical and powerful, each swing of the pickaxe a question posed to the ground beneath them. Alara matched his pace, her trips with the bucket becoming a blur of motion, her aching muscles forgotten in the face of their shared purpose. The pile of earth beside the well grew into a small mountain, a testament to their relentless effort. The dampness became more pronounced, the soil clumping together, smelling rich and loamy. The air in the hole grew cooler. Alara, leaning over the edge to take the bucket from Silas as he worked below, could feel the change. It was the breath of the deep earth, a sigh of hidden life. One afternoon, Silas's shovel made a new sound. Not the dull thud of earth or the sharp crack of rock, but a thick, sucking sound. A squelch. He stopped, perfectly still in the shadowed depths of the well. Alara held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the well's edge. Slowly, he bent down and scooped up a handful of what looked like mud. He straightened up and looked at her, his face streaked with dirt, unreadable in the gloom. He opened his hand. Water, dark with sediment, trickled between his fingers. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A sob, sharp and unexpected, escaped her. She clapped a hand over her mouth, embarrassed by the sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. All the fear, the hunger, the loneliness of the past months seemed to well up and spill over. He had done it. They had done it. Silas said nothing. He simply watched her for a moment, his gray eyes seeming to absorb her tears without judgment. Then he turned back to his work, his movements slower now, more careful, as he began to clear the mud and clay from the bottom, encouraging the slow, patient seep of water. It took another 2 days for the water to collect, to clear. They worked to shore up the sides of the well with stones they gathered from the plains, building a solid foundation to protect their discovery. During that time, a new kind of communication grew between them. It was still mostly silent, but it was a silence rich with understanding. She learned to anticipate when he would need a different tool, handing it down to him before he asked. He learned to read the lines of exhaustion on her face, insisting she rest in the shade while he continued the less strenuous work alone. They moved around each other with an unspoken awareness, a partnership forged in sweat and soil. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting the plains in hues of orange and rose, he finally climbed out of the finished well for the last time. He stood, covered in mud and grime, and looked at his handiwork. A foot of clear, still water rested at the bottom. "It will rise more overnight," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "It's a slow seep, but it's steady. It will be enough." "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "You have been. Every day." He gestured with his chin toward the mountain of dirt she had hauled. "This was not my well to dig alone." In his words, she heard an acknowledgement she hadn't even realized she craved. He saw her not as a damsel he had rescued, but as a partner in the work. He had not given her a gift, they had earned a victory together. It was a profound and subtle distinction that settled deep in her soul, shoring up the foundations of her own shattered self-worth. He began to pack his tools into his leather satchel, the familiar, methodical movements signaling the end of his time at her homestead. A sudden, sharp pang of loss went through her. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his work. The thought of the silence returning, of being truly alone again, was unexpectedly terrifying. The old, familiar despair threatened to surface. As he slung the heavy bag over his shoulder, preparing to leave, she saw it. A long, fresh tear in the sleeve of his shirt, snagged on a rock or a root during his final climb from the well. It was a stark, jagged rip in the sturdy fabric. An idea, born of desperation and a deep, aching need to give something back, to keep him there just a little longer, took root. "Your shirt," she said, her voice quiet. He glanced down at the tear, then back at her, his expression questioning. She took a breath, her heart pounding. It was a bold, perhaps foolish, offer. An invitation that could be easily misunderstood. But it was all she had. "Let me mend it," she said, her eyes pleading with him to understand her intent. "It's the least I can do. You could rest a while." Before you walk back, she gestured toward the small, clean space she had made inside the sod house, the table where the canteen still sat. "Mend your shirt for rest?" The question hung in the quiet air between them, an offering of her only skill in exchange for his continued presence, a fragile thread spun to bridge the silence. It was more than a shirt, more than a simple repair. It was an invitation into her home, into her life. A plea for him not to disappear back into the horizon, not just yet. He stood motionless for a long moment, the setting sun glinting off the metal buckles of his tool bag. The wind whispered through the dead corn stalks, the only sound in the vast twilight. Alara's offer hung in the air, a delicate, trembling thing. She watched his face, trying to read the unreadable landscape of his features. She saw the tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he considered her words. She expected him to refuse. A polite, gruff dismissal was the most she could hope for. He was a man of solitude. An invitation into the close confines of her home was a breach of the unspoken rules that governed their interactions. To her surprise, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He shrugged the heavy satchel from his shoulder and let it fall to the ground. Without a word, he pulled the torn, sweat-stained shirt over his head. The sight of him, bare-chested in the fading light, was startling. His body was a testament to his life's work, broad and powerfully muscled, but it was also a map of past pains. A web of old, silvery scars crisscrossed his back and shoulders, stark against his sun-darkened skin. They were the marks of a history he never spoke of, a violence she could only imagine. She quickly averted her eyes, a blush rising to her cheeks, feeling as though she had intruded on something deeply private. He held the shirt out to her. She took it, the rough, damp fabric warm from his body. "Come inside," she whispered, turning toward the door of the sod house before he could see the tremor in her hands. Inside, the small space was filled with the deep shadows of evening. She lit the small kerosene lamp on the table, and its warm, golden light pushed back the gloom, creating an island of intimacy in the vast, dark plains. The light softened the hard edges of the room, making it feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Silas entered behind her, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. He stood uncertainly by the door, as if unsure of his place in this small, domestic world. "Please," she said, gesturing to the single wooden chair beside the table. He moved toward it and sat, his movements careful, as if he were afraid of breaking something. Alara sat on the edge of her cot, her sewing basket beside her. She pulled out a needle and a spool of dark thread. Her hands, clumsy and stiff from hauling buckets of earth, felt foreign as she threaded the needle. But then the familiar motions took over, a muscle memory from a different life. She focused on the task, on the simple, repetitive act of drawing the thread through the fabric, her stitches small and even. Mending the shirt became an anchor in the swirling sea of her emotions. It was a tangible act of care, a way to express the gratitude that was too large for words. They sat in silence, the only sounds the soft hiss of the lamp and the tiny, rhythmic whisper of the needle passing through the cloth. The silence was different now, inside these four walls. It was thicker, more charged. She was acutely aware of him, of his stillness, of the quiet sound of his breathing. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her hands as she worked. After several long minutes, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "You handle a needle better than a shovel." It was not a criticism. There was a hint of something in his tone she had not heard before, a quiet teasing, almost a gentleness. She glanced up, a small, shy smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "And you handle a shovel better than anyone I've ever seen." He did not smile back, but the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften. He looked away from her, his gaze falling on the cracked mirror on the wall. "My mother taught me to mend," he said, his voice distant, as if speaking to a memory. She said a man who couldn't fix what was torn wasn't much of a man. It was the first piece of his past he had ever offered her, a tiny, precious stone unearthed from the deep well of his silence. She held on to it, turning it over in her mind. A mother. He had not sprung fully formed from the fire and iron of his forge. He had a history, a life before this one. "She taught you well, I imagine," Alara said softly, her eyes on her work. "She tried," he said. A pause. "Some things can't be mended." The words were heavy with unspoken meaning, and she knew he was no longer talking about shirts. He was talking about the scars on his back, about the war, about whatever had driven him to this solitary life at the edge of the world. She finished her work, knotting the thread and biting it off with her teeth. The tear was gone, replaced by a neat, strong seam that was barely visible. She had not just patched the hole, She had rewoven the fabric, making it whole again. She held it up, a small offering against the vastness of his unspoken pain. She rose and went to him, holding the shirt out. He stood to take it, and for a moment they were standing very close in the warm lamplight. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of earth and sweat and clean night air. He took the shirt, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The brief touch was like a spark, a sudden, unexpected connection that made her breath catch. He looked down at the seam she had sewn, running his thumb over the neat stitches. "It's stronger than it was before," he said quietly. He looked at her then, and his gray eyes were no longer unreadable. In their depths, she saw a flicker of something that looked like wonder, a quiet astonishment. He was looking at her not as the town did, as a pitiable, abandoned woman, but as someone capable, someone strong, someone who could take what was broken and make it whole again. He pulled the shirt on, the mended fabric settling over his broad shoulders. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the frame, his back to her. "The first rain," he said. "It will wash the dirt down, might cloud the well. You'll need to line the top with stones. I'll bring some from the quarry tomorrow." He was not leaving. He was finding another reason to come back. "Good night, Alara," he said, speaking her name for the first time. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness, leaving her alone in the quiet, lamp-lit room. She went to the door and watched him go, a dark shape moving steadily across the moonlit plains. She touched her fingers, the ones that had brushed against his, and felt the faint tingle of that contact still lingering. He had left her with a mended shirt, a functioning well, and a new, terrifyingly fragile sense of hope. And he had left her with her name, spoken in his low voice, which now echoed in the silence, making it feel, for the first time, not like an absence, but like a space waiting to be filled. The next morning, the world felt new. When Alara went to the well, the water had risen another few inches, a clear, placid mirror reflecting the vast blue sky. She lowered the bucket and hauled it up, hand over hand, marveling at its weight. The splash of the cool water on her face was a baptism. It washed away the grime of the past, the dust of despair. For the first time in months, she was not thirsty. It was a simple, profound miracle. True to his word, Silas arrived not long after sunrise. He was not on foot this time, but leading a stubborn, shaggy mule that pulled a small, sturdy cart. The cart was laden with flat, gray stones, carefully selected from a quarry miles away. The sight of him, of the effort he had gone to, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He had taken her problem as his own, and he was seeing it through to its conclusion. "The stones," he said by way of greeting, his voice its usual gruff rumble. "I see that," she replied, a genuine smile gracing her lips. "Good morning to you, too, Silas." A faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth might have been the shadow of a smile. He began to unload the stones, stacking them neatly beside the well. Alara picked up the smaller ones, her movements sure now, her body accustomed to the labor. They worked together, fitting the stones around the top of the well, building a low, solid wall to protect the precious water from the runoff and the ever-present dust. Their hands often brushed as they worked, and each time, Alara felt that same jolt of awareness, a quiet hum of connection that vibrated in the space between them. The work was finished by noon. The well was no longer just a hole in the ground. It was a permanent, finished thing, a testament to their combined effort. It was the anchor of her homestead, the heart of her small world. Silas stood back, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm, his eyes surveying their work with a quiet satisfaction. "That should hold," he said. His task was done. The well was dug. The pump was, for all intents and purposes, fixed. There was no reason for him to stay, no reason for him to return. The thought sent a chill of fear through her, cold and sharp. She could not bear the thought of his absence, of the silence descending once more. I made stew," she said quickly, the words rushing out. "From the last of the dried meat you gave me, and some roots. It's not much, but I would be honored if you would share it with me." It was another invitation, bolder than the last. Not an exchange of service for rest, but an offer of simple companionship. He looked from the finished well to her, his gray eyes searching her face. She held her breath, sure she had overstepped, that she had presumed a familiarity that did not exist. He was a man of solitude. He would prefer to return to his forge, to the company of his fire and iron. But again, he surprised her. "I would," he said, his voice quiet. The stew was thin, but it was hot and savory. They sat at the small table in her house. The door opened to the vast plains. The awkwardness of the previous night had dissipated, replaced by a comfortable, easy silence. They ate, their spoons scraping against the tin bowls, a domestic sound in the heart of the wilderness. As they ate, she found the courage to ask a question that had been hovering on her lips for days. "Mr. Sterling," she began, testing the name in the quiet room. "He said you weren't what you seem." What did he mean by that? Silas put his spoon down. He stared into his bowl for a long moment before he answered. "Sterling buys up land from folks who can't make it work. He gets the land cheap when they're desperate." He paused. "Sometimes, he helps them become desperate. He tried to do that with me," Alara said softly. "He told me the land would break me." "He was wrong," Silas said, and he looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "The land didn't break you. It showed you what you were made of." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever said such a thing to her. She had always been the fragile one, the one to be protected. Thomas had treated her like a delicate doll. The town saw her as a victim. But Silas saw her as a survivor. He saw the strength she hadn't known she possessed until it was all she had left. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of a woman she was only just beginning to recognize, a woman forged in hardship, tempered by loss, and stronger than she had ever imagined. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you made of, Silas?" He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. He looked out the door, at the endless expanse of the plains, his eyes clouded with memory. "I'm made of what's left over," he said finally, his voice low and heavy. After the fire, he looked down at his own hands, at the calluses and scars. "I was a soldier. I saw, and I did things that burn a man down to the foundations. When it was over, there wasn't much left to build with. So I came out here, where the land is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It makes no false promises." He had given her another piece of himself, a larger, heavier stone than the one before. She understood now. His silence wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. It was the wall he had built around the smoldering ruins of his past. And Sterling, with his greed and his cruelty, represented everything Silas had come here to escape: the casual viciousness of men, the lies, the pretense. "This land," Alara said, her voice filled with a new conviction, "it makes promises. But you have to be strong enough to hear them. And you have to be willing to work to keep them." She looked at the well outside, their shared promise, made real through their shared labor. He met her gaze, and in that long, silent look, a profound understanding passed between them. They were two broken people who had found, in this harsh and unforgiving place, a way to start mending, not just a well or a shirt, but themselves. They were two solitary souls who were, inexplicably, no longer entirely alone. The silence that fell between them now was not empty. It was full of unspoken gratitude, of shared history, of the tentative, fragile beginnings of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The attack came a week later, under the bruised purple sky of a coming storm. The air was thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension that mirrored the disquiet in Alara's own heart. Sterling had been too quiet. A man like that did not accept defeat with grace. He nursed his grievances until they festered into violence. Alara had spent the days since the well was finished in a state of heightened alert, her newfound hope tempered by a constant, low-level dread. She had worked her small plot of land, clearing the dead corn, preparing the soil near the well for a small, hardy garden of beans and squash. The work kept her hands busy, but it did not quiet her mind. Silas had returned twice. On the pretext of bringing her a sturdier bucket he had forged and a length of rope that would not fray. They had shared coffee, boiled over her small fire, and spoken in the spare, meaningful way that had become their language. His presence was a bulwark against her fear, a solid, reassuring fact in a world of uncertainty. But when he left, the silence he left behind felt deeper, the landscape more menacing. The storm was gathering in the west, a dark wall of clouds that swallowed the horizon. The wind picked up, moaning around the corners of the sod house. It was in this charged atmosphere that they came. She saw them first as 3 riders, dark shapes against the tumultuous sky, moving fast across the plains toward her homestead. One was clearly Sterling, his posture arrogant even at a distance. The other 2 were rough-looking men she recognized as hands from his ranch, men with cruel eyes and slack mouths. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. She was alone. Silas was miles away at his forge. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Her first instinct was to bolt the door, to cower inside her small house, and pray they would pass. But then Silas's words echoed in her mind. The land didn't break you. It showed you what you were made of. She would not hide. This was her home. She had fought for it. She would not surrender it to the likes of Sterling. She stepped out of the house, her late husband's old, heavy shotgun in her hands. She didn't even know if it was loaded, and she was a clumsy shot at best, but the weight of it in her hands was a comfort. She stood before her door, her feet planted firmly on the ground she had bled for, and waited. They reined in their horses a few yards away, the animals nervous and skittish in the charged air. Sterling's face was a mask of cold fury. "I gave you a chance, Mrs. Hayes," he snarled. "A fair chance. But you chose to throw in with that savage," he spat the word. "Now you'll learn the price of your foolishness. This land is mine. You'll have to kill me to take it," Alara said, her voice shaking only slightly as she raised the shotgun. Sterling laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That can be arranged," he nodded to one of his men. "Burn it. Burn it all." The man dismounted, a lit torch suddenly in his hand. He grinned, showing broken, yellowed teeth, and started toward the house. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She fumbled with the shotgun, trying to remember what Thomas had shown her. Her hands were slick with sweat. She was going to die. And then, another sound cut through the rising wind. The thunderous beat of horses' hooves, coming not from the direction of the town, but from the open plains. A single rider, moving with incredible speed, a dark avenging angel against the stormy sky. It was Silas. He must have seen the riders from his forge, must have known their intent. He rode not a mule, but a powerful black horse that seemed to eat the ground. He carried no gun. In his hand was the heavy forge hammer he used to shape steel. He did not slow as he reached them, but aimed his horse directly at the man with the torch. The man yelled in alarm and stumbled back, dropping the torch into the dust. Silas leaped from the horse before it had even stopped, landing with a solid thud. He moved with a terrifying speed and purpose, the grace of a predator. The second hired hand, who had been dismounting to help his partner, was met with the full force of Silas's charge. There was a sickening crunch of bone as Silas drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt, gasping for air. Sterling, his face pale with shock and rage, reached for the pistol at his hip, but Alara was already moving. Screaming with a fury she didn't know she possessed, she ran forward and swung the heavy stock of the shotgun like a club, catching Sterling's arm. The gun fired into the air with a deafening boom, the recoil jarring her to the bone. Sterling cried out in pain and surprise, his pistol clattering to the ground. The first man, having recovered the torch, scrambled to his feet and lunged toward the house again. But Silas was there. He did not use the hammer. He simply caught the man's wrist in a grip of iron, twisting it until the man shrieked and dropped the torch again. Silas spun him around and threw him bodily into the side of Sterling's horse. The animal whinnied in terror and reared, unseating Sterling, who tumbled ignominiously into the dust. It was over in seconds. The 2 hired hands scrambled away, one clutching his chest, the other his wrist, their appetite for a fight completely gone. They mounted their horses and fled, disappearing into the darkening plains. Sterling picked himself up, his fine clothes covered in dirt, his face a mask of humiliation and hatred. He stared at Silas, who stood over him, the heavy hammer held loosely at his side, his face grim, his chest heaving. Then he looked at Alara, who stood with the shotgun, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. He had come expecting to find a lone, helpless woman. He had found a fortress, defended by a silent blacksmith and a woman made of iron will. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "Yes," Silas said, his voice low and cold as steel. "It is." He took a single, deliberate step forward. That was all it took. Sterling stumbled back, his bravado shattered. He scrambled for his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and galloped away without a backward glance, a coward fleeing the field. They were left alone in the sudden, ringing silence. The storm was almost upon them, the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall. The wind whipped Alara's hair across her face. She was shaking, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving her weak and trembling. The heavy shotgun slipped from her numb fingers and thudded to the ground. Silas came to her. He did not speak. He simply reached out and placed his large, warm hand on her shoulder. The contact was grounding, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. She looked up at him, at his hard, protective face, and the last of her defenses crumbled. She leaned into him, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, the shirt she had mended, and finally allowed herself to weep. Not for fear, but for relief. For the terror that was past, and for the profound, overwhelming certainty that she was, for the first time in her life, truly safe. He stood as solid as the stones of his forge, his hand on her shoulder, sheltering her as the storm finally broke and the rain came down in a cleansing, silver sheet. The rain washed the world clean. It drummed on the sod roof, a soothing, rhythmic sound that muffled the memory of the violence. It turned the dust to dark, rich mud and filled the air with the clean, sharp scent of ozone and wet earth. Inside the small house, the lamplight cast a warm, steady glow. The storm outside was a raging fury, but within these walls, there was a profound and gentle peace. Alara had stopped crying. She sat at the table, a thick blanket Silas had retrieved from his horse's saddle roll wrapped around her shoulders. He had built up the fire in her small hearth, and its crackling warmth chased away the last of the chill from her bones. He sat opposite her, nursing a cup of coffee she had made, his presence a silent, comforting weight in the room. The forge hammer rested on the floor beside his chair, a sleeping guardian. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The shared danger, the desperate fight, had forged a new, deeper bond between them, a connection that transcended words. They had stood together, fought together, and won. They had defended their small patch of the world. Finally, Alara looked across the table at him. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing the weariness in his eyes. There was a long scratch on his cheek from the struggle, and his knuckles were raw. "You were hurt," she said softly. He touched his cheek, then dismissed it with a shake of his head. "It's nothing." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Are you all right?" "I am now," she said, and the truth of the words resonated deep within her. The fear was gone, replaced by a calm, quiet strength she had never known before. "I wasn't scared. Not really. I was angry." She looked down at her own hands, still trembling slightly. Angry that he thought he could just take it, that he thought I was weak. "He will not be back," Silas said. It was not a guess. It was a statement of fact. Men like Sterling are bullies. Their power comes from the fear of others. When someone stands up to them, they crumble. He had seen it in the war, she knew. He understood the nature of cowards. "We stood up to him," she corrected him gently. "We." A slow nod was his only reply, but his eyes softened. He understood the distinction. He accepted it. The storm began to abate, the fury of the wind lessening, the drumming of the rain softening to a steady patter. The world outside was being reborn, washed clean, given a new chance. Alara felt a similar transformation within herself. The woman who had stood trembling at the edge of a dry well, wearing her grief like a shroud, was gone. In her place was this new person, this woman who could face down a bully with a shotgun, who could find hope in a patch of damp earth, who could find companionship in the silence of a quiet man. "What will you do now?" Silas asked, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. It was a practical question. Sterling's threat was gone, but the hardships of the land remained. Winter was coming. The struggle was far from over. "I will plant a garden," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even her. "By the well. And I will build a stronger fence. And I will get through the winter." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "And I will not be alone." It was not a question. It was a statement of her hope, a declaration of the future she now dared to envision. A future that included him. He held her gaze for a long, heart-stopping moment. The fire crackled in the hearth. The rain whispered on the roof. She saw a dozen emotions flicker in the depths of his gray eyes: surprise, hesitation, a deep, bone-weary sadness, and then, finally, a fragile, tentative dawning of hope. He reached across the table and took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm, his calloused palm enveloping her smaller, work-roughened one. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, elemental connection. It was the touch of a partner, a protector, a friend. "No," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "You will not be alone." And in that simple promise, Alara found the answer to a prayer she had not even known how to utter. The emptiness that had haunted her for so long was filled. The silence that had been her constant companion was replaced by the steady, reassuring presence of the man who sat across from her, his hand holding hers, his eyes promising a shared future. The storm passed, leaving the night sky scrubbed clean and filled with a breathtaking canopy of stars. Silas did not leave. He stayed, sleeping on a blanket by the fire, a silent guardian in the quiet house. Alara lay on her cot, not sleeping, but listening to the sound of his breathing, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the dripping of water from the eaves. For the first time since she had come to this place, her home did not feel empty. It felt full. It felt safe. It felt like a beginning. The tattered bride was no more. The woman who lay listening to the quiet breathing of the blacksmith was someone new, someone whole, someone strong, someone who had found, in the heart of the dust-swept plains, not just water, but a reason to live.